Even though there isn't much magic going on right now, there's still magic product dropping. Here are my thoughts on each of the standard 2020 Challenger decks for Magic the Gathering. But before getting into the individual decks, I want to give a quick thought on the Challenger deck lineup in general. I think alongside the yearly Commander decks, this is the best line of products that is being put out by Wizards of the Coast, at least with regards to Magic the Gathering. The decks contain solid reprints of expensive and semi-expensive cards, and most of the decks are at least somewhat playable at F&M level events, and even the ones that aren't so much playable still have a lot of good pieces that can be put towards something more playable. Now with that out of the way, let's move on to the decks themselves, starting with Allied Fires. This is basically a version of the Fires of Invention Super Friends deck that popped up shortly after Oko got banned in Standard. And that deck was on top of the meta pile for about a week or two, and then just disappeared out of existence again. Fires decks have recently came back into the limelight in Standard with a more Cavalier Turbo-centric build featuring Planeswalkers and Kenrith. But with that explanation out of the way, let's go on to the list itself. Starting with the Planeswalkers, there are some really solid cards here with 4 copies of Sarkhan, with 1 being in the sideboard, 4 copies of Narset, amazing blue card, 3 copies of Keshmina, 2 copies of Saheeli, and single copies of Ugin, Ashiok, and Dovin Hand of Control. The Ashiok being the one from War of the Spark, not the Theros Beyond Death one. The Sarkhans, Narsets, and Ugin all make a lot of sense, but everything else in this lineup isn't as good in this kind of deck. The card that I was expecting to see here was a single copy of Teferi Time Raveler. I would have expected there to be more than one because it is the most expensive card in War of the Spark, but his complete absence is a bit strange considering he's played in pretty much every single version of this deck at 3 or 4. But let's move on to the creatures, which there are not many of. We got 1 Kenrith and 2 Fae of Wishes. Both are really good cards for this deck, but Kenrith is the one you really want to be playing. Fae could be played in this deck, and having extra copies of it is nice, but it doesn't work as well in this kind of deck. But on to the other spells. You have Deafening Clarion, which are very good in this deck, which is even now being played in current builds of Fires decks. I think they should have put 4 in because that's what everyone is running, almost. Some people run 3, but having the option would have been nice. The Drawn from Dreams was played in earlier versions of this deck, and having 2 of them is nice. So if you are going for trying to build this deck, then Drawn from Dreams is a nice option to have. Time Wipe is also okay, but it's not as good as Deafening Clarion, and isn't really seen play now either. On to the enchantments, you have 4 Fires of Invention, because this is a Fires deck, 2 Banishing Light, and 4 Omen of the Sea, which are good cards in their own right, but they don't really belong in the Fires deck. Well, on to the most exciting part of this deck, which is the lands. You get a Steam Immense, which is one of the most played shock lands across all formats. You get 3 different singleton copies of Scry lands in the deck. 4 copies of Interplanetary Beacon, which works in the standard version of Fire's Friends. But the rest here is just kind of meh. You get the life gain lands, which are okay, but not really expensive or anything. But now time to look over the sideboard, and it isn't great. Sarkhan probably should just be in the main deck if you're playing the Super Friend Fire version of the deck. But I can guess if you want to use Fae of Wishes to search it up, it would be okay. Mass Manipulation's also fine. Devout Decree is actually really good. Veto is kind of meh, because this is a Fires deck you can counter on your own turn, but can't counter on your opponent's. And then the rest is just... it exists. It doesn't really work here. But my final thoughts on this deck is that it has some solid reprints, and it's a decent shell that you can work around to build something good. The problem is that it's just a shell you have here. You have Kenrith, the Fires, the Narsets, Clarions, and some good lands. There are some other pieces you could do something with, such as Sarkhan, Ugin, a few other things, but that isn't a full deck. I think that a lot of this could have been improved if there was just a single copy of Teferi Time Raveler. The value of this Challenger deck is lower than the others in the lineup, and Teferi would have definitely helped bolster the value of the deck and also helped it to be a bit more playable. Well, on to the next deck here with Flash of Ferocity. This is a Simic Flash deck, a deck that's been around since M20. The deck was around during Oko format and was doing well for itself before and even after Oko was banned. But the deck has fallen a bit far from where it used to be, but it's still putting up results in standard tournaments even now, albeit usually with a copy of Uro or two hiding somewhere on the list. But onto the deck list itself. One copy of Brazen Borrower. Borrower is this deck's non-land money card. It is commonly ran at either 3 or 4 in most versions of this deck, but because it's so high value, it's fine enough value-wise even if you're only just getting one copy. The rest of the creatures are pretty much all stuff you'd expect to see in Simic Flash builds at varying numbers, with the notable exception of the Wave Rank Hippocamp, which doesn't see play in Simic Flash. You get 4 Night Pack Ambushers, great finisher, Brineborn Cutthroat, also really good, all of which are standard at 4 in Simic Flash. Frilled Mystic, Spectral Sailor, they both get played at any numbers ranging between 2 and 4, depending on the preference of the player. Wildborn Preserver is a card that is good in either the main deck or the side deck, and also doesn't really have a set number of copies that you have to play, or even if you have to play it at all, but it's still a very good card. And a good thing about this deck is that you really get to decide how many you want to play of these cards, because out of the box, you get 4 copies of each. On to the spells. There are 2 copies of Thassa's Intervention, 4 Opt, 4 Quench, 2 Sinister Sabotage, and 2 Unsummon. These are a lot of cards that are pretty regular in instant slots of Simic Flash, with sort of a rotating door of which one gets played and which one doesn't. But a change that the deck has recently taken is where Opt hasn't really seen play anymore, and is in its place has 4 copies of Growth Spiral. Actually, a lot of cards in this deck's sideboard are now mainboarded. The current Simic Flash decks are actually playing 2 copies of Negate, Aether Gust, and Mystical Dispute all in the main, due to the meta's current reliance on non-creature spells, stuff that's in green, and a heavy flux of blue. Aside from mild tweaks to the ratios here, there isn't much more that can be said about the instance other than they are all solid options for this deck. But on to the ever-important part, the lands. Foremost is a single copy of Fabled Passage, which is an all-star in both Pioneer, Standard, and Commander. Great card here, and just a very valuable card in general, that's almost bound to maintain its value moving forward. The other 2 notes here are the inclusion of Castle Vantress and Temple of Mystery, both of which are really good in this deck, and it would have been nice if they included a copy of Breeding Pool, but this deck has good enough value in it already that it's definitely worth the buy. And finally, there's the side deck. All of the stuff here is things that you can play, and don't really feel bad for playing them. Dispute is very good in this format and in this deck, and as mentioned before, should probably just be moved to the main board till the meta shifts a bit away from blue. But overall with this deck, it's both value-wise and playability-wise very good. The only real issue here is that a lot of this deck is rotating in September because a lot of it came from M20. But on the bright side, the most valuable card in this deck, Brazen Borrower and Fabled Passage, both survive rotation, along with a few other really good playables. This is a Challenger deck that I could see buying 2 of, being the most advantageous route, where you take the extra copies of Borrower, Passage, and Temple for yourself, and then trade the rest off for other things you might need, like more copies of Borrower or different dual lands. But now with that out of the way, let's move on to the obligatory red aggro deck. Red aggro has been the main focus of a Challenger deck every single year this product has been released. And every year, mono red is also the most playable out of the box. This time, it's still no exception. This aggro deck is a bit more focused on the red enchantment Cavalcade of Calamity, which was a build that was very popular for a while, but has since fallen a bit out of favor and is now taken the place of stuff like Annex and Embercleave focus builds. But let's move on to the list itself. You get 3 Chandra Acolyte of Flame, which is a great card in Cavalcade, but isn't so much played in the Tier 1 mono-red builds now. But still a lot of really good mono-red cards here, especially ones that are played today, such as 4 copies of Bone Crusher Giant, 4 Fervent Champion, 4 Runaway Steamkin, 4 Torbran, 4 Rimrock, 4 Scorch Spitter, and you have 3 copies of Tin Street Dodger, which that last one really is only played in the Cavalcade variants. The lands here are pretty okay, which you get 3 Castle and Breath. You probably just want the 4th one and trade out 1 mountain, but the ratio is actually very correct. With the sorceries, you have the obligatory 4 Light Up the Stage, which is definitely a good card in this deck. In fact, it's a great card, and it's probably one of the main reasons that this deck is as successful as it is. The 1 Embercleave. Embercleave being the way to end a game really quickly, and definitely the money card of this deck. Then you have the 4 Cavalcade, which you don't really need to play the Cavalcade nowadays because you have access to sort of better red aggro cards like Annex and Robber of Riches. I would honestly take out the Cavalcades and put in Annex, and even on a budget this isn't a problem because Annex, even if you were getting 4 copies, is only probably like $1 for the whole playset. And you could probably actually just trade the Cavalcades out for that. The sideboard here is decent-ish. You have the Tybalt Rakish Instigator, which is good. That's one you probably would be keeping no matter what in this side deck. But the problem is a lot of the other cards here really don't see play in this meta. Experimental Frenzy is another one that you could still play, but there's just better cards you can play than Shock out of the side. But overall, this deck is definitely the most playable right out of the box, because even the Cavalcade version of this deck is still very strong, and Torbran is just an immensely powerful card. Value-wise, it's also sitting very, very well. But there is one issue I hold with this deck, and that's with how playable it is going forward due to the rotation of Light Up the Stage and Steamkin. There's a good chance that replacements will pop up, or that they already exist, but for current standard playability, this deck is definitely one to look at. But on to the final deck, we have Final Adventure. This is Golgari Adventures, a sort of tempo combo deck relying upon adventure payoffs, Edgewall Innkeeper, and Lucky Clover to just outvalue your opponent and snipe them with Smitten Swordmaster's adventure ability. It was really strong during Oko format, but Oko format's long over, and it has since completely fallen off the map. But let's move on to the deck list. You get a Vraska, which, while a valuable card, doesn't really work in this deck, though it's still a nice reprint to have your hands on. On to the creatures, you get 4 copies of Edgewall Innkeeper, 4 Lovestruck Beast, 4 Foulmire Knight, 4 Order of Midnight, and 4 Smitten Swordmaster. And with the 2 ofs, you have 2 Black Lance Paragon, 2 Knight of the Ebon Legion, 2 Midnight Reaper, and 2 Murderous Rider. Pretty much everything is here that you would expect, except for the Knight of the Ebon Legion. Again, it's an expensive card that's good, but it's not good here. You'll probably want 2 more copies of every other 2 of in this deck. Black Lance is versatile at beating a beater and a combat trick, while also having the Knight type to fuel your Smitten Swordmaster burn effect. And you definitely want 4 copies of Murderous Rider, because it's the best adventure in the deck, because destroying creatures and planeswalkers is really good when you're trying to combo off and not die. Midnight Reaper is also really good, because getting to have the recursion ability of, after being board nuked, just drawing more cards and potentially getting you more Lucky Clovers, more Edgewall Innkeepers, and more Smitten Swordmasters is always a good thing. But on the sorcery side, we have 2 Fine Finalities, which, while good, probably would be better in the side deck, because Order of the Night already has recursion effect, and Finality is the only part you'd really want to be casting at that point, and you don't really need to main deck board wipes in this thing. Disfigure, while a good pauper card, isn't really something you want to be playing here, because you already have Murderous Rider, which is just strictly more applicable in most situations. And especially you don't want to be playing Disfigure in the main. It's more of a side deck card if you even want to play it. Artifacts-wise, you have the 4 of Combo Enabler, that being Lucky Clover. This allows for big draws with Foulmire, big recursion with Order of Midnight, and the all-important big burn with Smitten Swordmaster. But now on to the all-important lands. We have another really good selection here with the all-important Fabled Passage, which is just a very strong card in general, but isn't as necessary in this standard because you still have access to Shockland, so you might not even want to play this till rotation, but it then gets much better because then you do have access to all of your land colors in case. You also have 2 copies of Lockwayne, which is great in any deck with a lot of swamps, and the Temples, which also sadly rotate in September, but are still really good in this deck. But if we move on to the side deck, it's actually doing pretty well for itself. It has very good side cards like Massacre Girl, Duress, Thrashing Brontodon, and probably the best of all here is the Noxious Grasp. Especially because we are in the Uro meta. And it also hits Nissa, who shakes the meta. Cling to Dust is also pretty decent, but hard to resolve twice in this deck, and the Harpooner isn't good in this meta right now. The changes I would really make to this side deck is putting in 4 Agonizing Remorse, which could replace a few of the Duresses and all of the Harpooners. Overall, though, this is my favorite out of the bunch. While not being most playable out of the box, and definitely not the most valuable, it does contain a lot of cards that don't rotate, and it has cards that see play in other formats. This one, just like Flash of Ferocity, is one where you would probably buy 2 because you need the extra copies of Murderous Rider, Black Lance Paragon, Passage, Lockwayne, and you probably also want the Midnight Reapers. And while it's not the best deck right now, it's definitely something that you will be able to play past the rotation, and has pieces that you can move into other formats like Pioneer with cards like Murderous Rider, Knight of Even Legion, and Lockwayne. And there's also other funky ways that you can choose to upgrade it by putting in, well, upgrade, but you can put in things like Beanstalk Giant or Reaper of Midnight if you want to have other different types of value in long games. But overall, I think that this year's Challenger decks are good improvement over last year's with regards to both value and playability, and that you aren't making a bad buy with any of them. They all really, or getting one all really has to do with what you want to do in Magic the Gathering. If you want to win in Standard right away, Mono Red's the way to go. Want non-rotating expensive pieces along with a pretty decent selection of cards that will hold you over until the rotation hits? Civic Flash does that. Want to be experimental with Fires of Invention or just want some decent lands and good cards for your commander deck? Then get the Fire's Friends deck. Want a standard deck prepared for when rotation hits or just want mono black staples? Then Golgari Adventures. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video and got something out of it. Hope you all have a nice day.